The prestigious Royal London Hospital, nestled in the affluent district of Mayfair, was on the brink of a groundbreaking trial. The arrival of a talented nurse, Regina Holmes, a brilliant black woman, would unknowingly expose the deeply rooted biases within the institution. While Regina remained unaware of the storm brewing ahead, the atmosphere was charged with tension. As things escalated, a seemingly ordinary patient, a quiet man known only as David Bowie, observed everything from his hospital bed. But David Bowie was no ordinary patient. His mere presence would become a catalyst for change. What hidden power did this mysterious man hold? How would one nurse's fight for equality spark a revolution in an institution as entrenched as this? The hospital sparkled under harsh fluorescent lights as Regina Holmes began her shift. The scent of antiseptic mixed with a palpable sense of unease in the sterile environment. Despite her nervousness, Regina stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that real change often begins with a single, defiant step. As Regina Holmes approached the nurse's station, an unsettling silence enveloped the room. Conversations abruptly stopped, and people averted their gazes, the atmosphere thick with unspoken judgment. Battling the growing sense of isolation, she cleared her throat and spoke with quiet confidence. "Excuse me, I'm Regina Holmes, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" A nurse with platinum blonde hair glanced up, her icy blue eyes momentarily widening before she quickly masked it with a tight, practiced smile. Her voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable coolness to it. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Regina nodded and walked away, acutely aware of the eyes following her every move. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, each step amplifying the heavy tension in the air. As she neared the head nurse's office, a tall figure in a white coat emerged from a nearby room. With graying hair and an authoritative posture, he looked every bit the seasoned doctor. Regina's heart skipped a beat, silently hoping for a welcoming encounter. But a nagging feeling told her that the interaction ahead would be far from ordinary. "Good morning, Doctor," Regina Holmes greeted, her smile warm but her nerves hidden beneath the surface. "I'm Regina Holmes, the new nurse. It's a pleasure to meet you." Dr. William Greaves's grey eyes swept over her, cold and appraising, his expression impassive. "Dr. William Greaves," he said, his tone clipped. "I trust you're familiar with our protocols. We maintain the highest standards here. I hope you're prepared to meet them." With that, he brushed past her, his white coat swishing with authority, leaving Regina standing in the hallway, her hand falling slightly at her side. For a brief moment, discouragement tugged at her resolve. But she didn't let it show. She straightened up, inhaled deeply, and with steady determination, knocked on the head nurse's door. As she waited, her mind wandered back to nursing school, to the words her mother had once spoken to her, words that had always kept her going. "Baby girl," her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a blend of pride and concern. "You'll have to work harder than anyone else. But never let 'em see you sweat. You come from strong women. And you have that strength in you." Regina remembered those late nights spent studying, the countless hours in the lab, and the constant need to prove herself. She recalled the subtle dismissals from professors, the raised eyebrows when she aced exams, and the whispers from classmates questioning her place. But she pushed through it all, graduating at the top of her class. Standing in the sterile, impersonal halls of St. Mary's, Regina drew strength from those memories. She had conquered adversity before, and she would do it again. The door swung open with a sharp click, revealing a stern-looking woman. "Miss Holmes, I presume," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Come in, we have much to cover, and I expect you to keep up." Following the head nurse into the office, Regina Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far greater than just a job. The atmosphere in the hospital was thick with tension, a silent storm waiting to erupt beneath the surface of polite smiles and hollow greetings. Little did she know, her arrival would become a turning point, a challenge to deep-seated prejudices and a crack in the toxic foundation of the institution. The rest of Regina's first day blurred by in a haze of orientation and paperwork. As she walked through the sterile, gleaming halls, a sense of subtle exclusion gnawed at her. Conversations came to a sudden halt when she neared, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. Attempts at small talk were met with polite, but distant replies. She felt like an outsider, a solitary figure in a place that should have embraced collaboration. By the time the workday came to a close, Regina was drained. As she packed up her things, she overheard a conversation between two nurses nearby. "Did you see the new hire?" one asked, her voice dripping with quiet disdain. "Yeah," the other replied, a cold edge to her words. "I don't know what they were thinking. This place isn't exactly for, well, you know." Regina's hand froze on her locker, her heart sinking. The cool reception she had felt earlier had been more than mere discomfort, it was prejudice. Plain and simple, she knew, without a doubt, that the road ahead would be a battle. Leaving the hospital, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. At the bus stop, she dialed her mother's number, trying to steady her emotions. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Her mother's voice greeted her warmly. A comfort she desperately needed. Fighting back tears, Regina whispered, "It was challenging, Mama." After a brief silence, her mother's voice came through, steady and strong. "Regina Marie Holmes, listen to me. You've fought too hard, worked too long, to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are. You're standing there for every young black girl who dreams of walking through those halls one day." Regina closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her, grounding her in the strength she sometimes forgot she had. "I know, Mama, it's just harder than I thought." Her mother's voice softened but remained unwavering. "Nothing that's worth it comes easy, baby, but you carry the strength of generations with you. Keep your head high, excel in everything you do, and never let 'em see you falter. You hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Regina affirmed, her voice now steady, filled with the resolve that had always been there but now burned brighter than ever. As she ended the call, Regina noticed a sleek black Mercedes slow to a stop in front of her. Through the tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, his eyes fixed on her with a gaze that seemed more curious than kind. Before she could react, the car sped off, disappearing into the night. Regina straightened her posture, her mother's words echoing in her mind. The battle ahead would be tough. But she wasn't alone. With her family's strength and her own resolve, she would rise above the challenges at St. Mary's. Waiting for the bus, Regina prepared herself for another day, unaware that her presence at the hospital would set off a chain of events, one that would test the institution's foundations, expose its deep-seated prejudices, and demand the change that had long been overdue. The weeks that followed were filled with mounting tension for Regina at St. Mary's. What began as subtle coldness soon escalated into a more insidious form of exclusion, difficult to pinpoint, yet impossible to ignore. During her morning rounds, Regina couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. Dr. William Greaves, in particular, seemed to take a particular pleasure in nitpicking her work, no matter how meticulously she performed her duties. One morning, as she was finishing her rounds, Dr. Greaves's booming voice cut through the quiet of the ward. "Nurse Holmes," he called, his tone sharp and dismissive. "I trust you're familiar with our protocols. We can't afford mistakes." The way he emphasized mistakes made the word hang in the air like a threat, sending an icy chill down Regina's spine. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to allow his words to intimidate her. "Of course, Dr. Greaves, I'm well versed in all hospital procedures." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. "We'll see. Let's hope you've learned everything you need to know while you're here." His words, laced with disdain, rang out clearly, for all to hear, particularly the group of nurses who were quietly observing the exchange. As Dr. Greaves walked away, Regina could feel the weight of judgment bearing down on her like a heavy cloud. Throughout the day, it became painfully clear that she was being given the most difficult, undesirable tasks, while her white colleagues were handed easier cases with little to no challenge. She was repeatedly assigned to demanding patience and complex procedures, work that seemed designed to wear her down. "Regina, would you mind taking Mr. Johnson in room 305? A nurse asked, her tone deceptively sweet. "He's been a bit challenging." Regina nodded, fully aware that challenging was a euphemism. Mr. Johnson had a reputation for his racist outbursts, and she had heard the stories. But she wasn't about to back down. She was determined to prove herself. As she walked toward his room, she steeled herself for what was coming. Entering the room, she braced for the inevitable tirade, unsure if this was yet another test or a deliberate attempt to set her up for failure. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I told him I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Regina inhaled deeply, her body tensing in response to the hateful words. But she remained calm, her voice steady and professional. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm more than qualified." Enduring a barrage of racial slurs, Regina remained outwardly composed, her professionalism unshaken. She completed each task with precision, focusing solely on her work and refusing to let the vile bigotry affect her performance. As she emerged from the room, she found Dr. Greaves standing nearby, his expression masked in faux concern. "Everything all right, Nurse Holmes?" he asked, his tone falsely empathetic. "We heard a commotion." Regina met his gaze evenly, not flinching. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need?" A flicker of surprise crossed Dr. Greaves's face before it was quickly replaced by a thinly veiled smirk of condescension. "Well, let's hope you maintain that composure with all patience," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We wouldn't want any complaints. Now, would we?" As Dr. Greaves walked away, Regina felt as though she had just passed an unfair, unwinnable test. The rest of her shift blurred into a series of demanding tasks and subtle slights, each one adding weight to her already heavy burden. She had to double-check every action, every decision, knowing that even the smallest mistake would be scrutinized, magnified, and used against her. Her white colleagues seemed to glide effortlessly through their shifts, laughing and chatting while Regina struggled under the weight of her overwhelming workload. The inequality was glaring, impossible to ignore, but, as she recalled her mother's voice, "Don't you dare let him see you falter," Regina held her silence, keeping her frustrations buried deep inside. By the time the day ended, Regina was drained, physically and emotionally. As she gathered her things, she overheard two nurses whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about diversity hires?" one muttered, her voice dripping with contempt. "It's not like they can keep up with us." Regina's hand froze as the words hit her like a slap. Her instinct screamed to defend herself, to confront them, but she knew that doing so would only confirm their prejudices and further isolate her. With a deep breath, she closed her locker and walked away, her head held high despite the storm of emotions brewing within her. As she waited for the bus, the familiar black Mercedes pulled up once again. Dr. Greaves leaned out the window, his voice laced with false concern. "Nurse Holmes, waiting for the bus again? Is that all you can afford on a nurse's salary?" he mocked. His words meant to sting. Then, Dr. Greaves sped off, leaving Regina standing there, the sting of humiliation burning deeply. His cruel words echoed in her mind, cutting through her like a sharp blade. The injustice was overwhelming, but she refused to let it break her. On the bus ride home, Regina's mind raced. The excitement she had once felt about her new job had been replaced by a cold, steely determination to survive. A quiet voice within her whispered that something had to change. But the question lingered, would she break under the constant pressure? Or would she find a way to force the change that was so desperately needed? Little did she know, an unexpected ally was on their way. Someone who would help expose the deep-seated prejudices at St. Mary's and give her the strength to push for what was right. As the bus rolled along, Regina closed her eyes, drawing strength from her mother's unwavering support, holding on to the promise that tomorrow would be another battle, one she would fight with everything she had. The following morning, Regina arrived at St. Mary's with a renewed sense of purpose. She reminded herself why she had become a nurse in the first place: to help people, to care for them, no matter their background or beliefs. Entering the nurses' station, Regina immediately noticed the flurry of activity. Nurses were scrambling to prepare a room, the air thick with anticipation. "What's going on?" she asked, curious, forgetting her usual cool demeanor. A nurse eagerly responded, "We've got a VIP patient coming in, a big shot who broke both arms in a skiing accident." Before Regina could ask for more details, Dr. Greaves appeared, his expression unusually stern. "Nurse Holmes," he snapped, his voice curt, "I need you to handle Mr. Thomas Edwards in room 412. He's the VIP with the skiing accident. Provide him with the utmost care." Regina's stomach tightened. She knew this was another test, another challenge she had to face. "Of course, Dr. Greaves, I'll take care of it." Walking toward room 412, Regina couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was different. The patient's importance, hinted at by the hushed conversations around the hospital, made her both curious and somewhat apprehensive. When she entered the room, she saw a man lying in bed, both arms encased in heavy casts. Despite his obvious injuries, there was an unmistakable air of quiet authority about him, as if he commanded respect even in his weakened state. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," she greeted him with a warm smile, trying to mask her nerves. "I'm Nurse Regina Holmes, and I'll be taking care of you today." Mr. Edwards turned his head to look at her, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Good morning, Nurse Holmes," he replied, his voice strong and unwavering. "I appreciate your help. I didn't expect to end up here after my accident." As Regina checked his vitals, she couldn't help but notice the intensity with which Mr. Edwards watched her. Unlike many of the other patients, and certainly most of the staff she had encountered, he showed no signs of prejudice. Only a genuine curiosity. "You seem very competent, Nurse Holmes," he remarked, his tone both respectful and insightful. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Regina was taken aback by his interest. It was rare to be treated with such respect in this environment. She paused for a moment, weighing her response. "A few weeks, sir," she answered carefully, the weight of her words heavier than usual. It's been quite an experience. Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, a trace of amusement flickering in his eyes. I see. And how has the hospital lived up to its reputation? Regina hesitated, unsure of how to respond to such a loaded question. Just as she opened her mouth, Dr. Greaves burst into the room. His expression suddenly transformed, replaced by an uncharacteristic smile and cheerfulness. A demeanor Regina had never seen before. Mr. Edwards, Dr. Greaves exclaimed with warmth, his tone overly enthusiastic. I trust Nurse Holmes is taking excellent care of you? We only assign our best to our most distinguished patients. Regina fought to suppress her surprise. She had never seen Dr. Greaves show this kind of confidence in her before. However, it didn't go unnoticed by Mr. Edwards, who seemed to sense the discrepancy. Indeed, Dr. Greaves, Mr. Edwards replied, his eyes flicking thoughtfully between Regina and the doctor. Nurse Holmes has been exemplary. I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's. For a brief moment, Dr. Greaves's smile faltered, his mask slipping, but he quickly regained his composure, brushing it off with a smooth, practiced tone. Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on our supportive and inclusive environment. Regina felt a surge of anger rise within her at the blatant hypocrisy of Dr. Greaves's words. Yet, she forced herself to remain professional, her composure unwavering. Mr. Edwards, however, clearly sensed the tension that hung in the air. Is that so? He mused, his gaze still fixed intently on Regina, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. Well, I certainly look forward to experiencing this supportive environment myself. As Dr. Greaves continued to outline Mr. Edwards's proposed treatment plan, Regina couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important, something that could finally tip the scales in her favor. Mr. Edwards was more than just a VIP patient, his words, his demeanor, suggested a deep understanding of the underlying issues at St. Mary's. For the first time, Regina allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. What she didn't know was that Mr. Edwards's unexpected presence would soon set in motion a chain of events that would shake St. Mary's to its core, exposing the hospital's long-held prejudices and demanding accountability for the injustice that had run unchecked for so long. As the days passed, Regina found herself becoming increasingly isolated at St. Mary's. The subtle slights had evolved into more overt hostility. Whispers followed her wherever she went, her every move scrutinized by colleagues who clearly didn't want her there. Dr. Greaves made little effort to hide his disdain, his every action aimed at undermining her authority and competence. One morning, as he handed her an especially large stack of patient charts, his voice dripped with thinly veiled condescension. Nurse Holmes, Dr. Greaves said with a smirk, I need you to handle these cases. They're some of our more challenging ones. I trust you're up to the task? Regina immediately recognized this for what it was, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm her. To test her limits, she met his gaze steadily, her determination unwavering. Of course, Dr. Greaves, I'll take care of them right away. As he walked away, his smirk still in place, Regina overheard him muttering to another doctor in a voice that was just loud enough for her to hear. Let's see how she handles this. It should be quite interesting. Throughout the day, Regina rushed from case to case, providing compassionate and professional care to even the most demanding patients, despite the growing exhaustion and the weight of constant scrutiny bearing down on her. It seemed as though her colleagues were watching, waiting for her to slip up, eager to confirm their own prejudices and biases. Every move she made was under the microscope, and the pressure was suffocating. As she rushed to answer another call light, Regina overheard two nurses gossiping in a quiet corner of the hallway. Can you believe they're giving her all those critical cases? One nurse asked, her voice dripping with disdain. It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up so they can say, I told you so. I know, replied the other, but somehow she just keeps going. I would have cracked under the pressure by now. Regina's heart clenched with a surge of anger and hurt, but she shoved those feelings down, focusing on the needs of her patients. The whispers were loud and clear. They weren't just aware of the unfairness of the situation. They were actively hoping for her failure. She had to remind herself that she couldn't let their expectations define her. Making her way to Mr. Edwards's room once again, Regina felt as though she were entering a rare sanctuary. His calm presence and steady support had become a comforting refuge amidst the hostility she faced at every turn in the hospital. Nurse Holmes, Mr. Edwards greeted her warmly, his voice like a balm. You look absolutely exhausted. Is everything all right? Managing a weak smile, Regina answered, just a particularly busy day. Mr. Edwards, nothing I can't handle. Mr. Edwards studied her closely, his eyes piercing through the facade she had carefully constructed. There's a considerable difference between merely handling something and actually thriving in the process. he said thoughtfully, "and I believe you are more than capable of the latter." His unexpected kindness and genuine concern only served to highlight the stark contrast between his behavior and the cold indifference of the rest of the staff. A lump formed in Regina's throat, threatening to spill over into tears. She quickly blinked him back, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I truly appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, Mr. Edwards called out softly, his words carrying a weight that felt almost prophetic. "Nurse Holmes, please remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies in speaking up, even when it feels impossible." Walking out of the room, Regina had a distinct feeling that something was about to change, that the carefully constructed facade of St. Mary's was about to crumble. And she might be the one to bring it down. The next day, Regina arrived to find the hospital abuzz with more activity than usual. There was talk of a high-stakes emergency operation later that afternoon, and several important visitors were expected to observe the procedure. As she began her rounds, she could sense the nervous energy coursing through the hospital like an electric current. Midway through her duties, Dr. Greaves approached her, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made Regina uneasy. "Nurse Holmes," he said, his tone carefully neutral but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "We need you to assist in the emergency operation this afternoon. It's a particularly critical case, and we need all hands on deck. I trust you're adequately prepared?" Regina felt a rush of surprise mixed with suspicion. Why her, especially after everything Dr. Greaves had done to sideline her? She forced herself to remain calm and professional. "Of course, Dr. Greaves, I'll be ready and waiting." As he turned and walked away, Regina overheard him mutter to another doctor, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "Let's see how she handles the pressure cooker of an emergency. This should certainly be interesting, one way or another." Knowing that she was likely walking into a trap, Regina worked tirelessly to prepare for the operation, reviewing procedures and protocols until she could recite them in her sleep. When the time came to scrub in, she could feel the weight of skeptical and judgmental gazes from the other staff members. She took a deep breath, recalling her mother's unwavering words, "Don't you dare let 'em see you falter. Regina, hold your head high and show 'em what you're made of." The operation began, and the tension in the room was almost tangible, the air thick with nerves and anticipation. As Dr. Greaves made the initial incision, Regina noticed that his hands were trembling ever so slightly, an uncharacteristic sign of nerves. The gravity of the situation, combined with the pressure of the observers, seemed to be getting to him. Then, as Dr. Greaves prepared to make a critical maneuver, Regina's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized, with a jolt of horror, that he was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without hesitating for even a second, Regina spoke up, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "Dr. Greaves," she said calmly, "perhaps we should consider approaching the dissection from a slightly different angle? The patient's unique anatomical structure suggests that it might be safer and more effective in the long run." The room went completely silent, as if time itself had frozen. Every single person turned to look at her, eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Greaves stared at her with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and perhaps even a flicker of fear. He was clearly furious that she had dared to question his judgment, especially in front of such a high-stakes audience. But after what felt like an eternity, he nodded almost imperceptibly, his pride stung but his professionalism, albeit begrudgingly, taking precedence. Reluctantly, he adjusted his approach, following Regina's suggestion with barely concealed irritation. As the operation continued, it became increasingly clear that her timely intervention had likely saved the patient's life. The new approach was proving to be far safer and more effective than the original plan, and the patient's condition began to stabilize under their careful hands. As the surgery came to a close, successful and much smoother than anticipated, Regina felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some were filled with newfound respect, while others simmered with barely contained anger and resentment, their disapproval of her boldness still fresh. After the operation, as they began to clean up the room, Dr. Greaves finally spoke, his voice low and threatening. "Nurse Holmes, I need to see you in private. Immediately, we have some things to discuss." Regina's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline from the surgery still coursing through her veins. She knew she had done the right thing, that she had saved a life, but she was also painfully aware that she was about to pay a steep price for her insubordination. Instead of leading her to his office, Dr. Greaves directed Regina to a nearby private room. It wasn't until she stepped inside that she realized it was Mr. Edwards's room. In his fury, it seemed that Dr. Greaves had completely forgotten that the VIP patient was still recovering there. But he was too consumed by his anger to care about such trivialities. As the door slammed shut behind them, Dr. Greaves exploded, his face contorted with rage. "How dare you question my judgment in front of everyone like that?" he shouted. His voice filled with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I should fire you right here and now for such blatant insubordination and disrespect." Despite the fear swirling inside her, Regina stood her ground. She met his furious gaze with a steady one of her own. Refusing to back down. "Dr. Greaves, I was simply doing my job, prioritizing the safety and well-being of the patient." "Your job," Dr. Greaves sneered, cutting her off. "Your job is to follow orders and keep your mouth shut, not to think that you know better than me. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious hospital like St. Mary's. You're only here because of some ridiculous diversity scheme, not because of any actual skill or talent." As Dr. Greaves's tirade grew more personal and openly racist, Regina felt a wave of emotions wash over her: anger, despair, and a profound sense of injustice. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the true nature of the prejudice and discrimination that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Just then, a clear, commanding voice cut through the oppressive silence. "Dr. Greaves," the voice said calmly but firmly, "I believe you've forgotten yourself and the rules of professional conduct. Haven't you?" Turning sharply, Regina and Dr. Greaves saw that Mr. Edwards had propped himself up in bed, his eyes fixed on them with an expression of barely contained fury. His gaze, which had once seemed so kind and understanding, was now cold and piercing, radiating authority. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his face turning a shade of red almost as deep as the anger that had consumed him moments before. "I am terribly sorry. I had no idea that you were awake and listening." "Oh, I've been awake for quite some time, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards responded evenly, his voice unwavering, "and I've been observing your treatment of Nurse Holmes with increasing dismay. What I have witnessed has been nothing short of appalling." Regina stood frozen, unsure of how to react. She had never seen Mr. Edwards like this before. He was exuding an aura of power and authority she hadn't known he possessed. This was no longer just the VIP patient, it was a man who had had enough. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice trembling now, completely losing its former arrogance. "I assure you, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I only had the best interests of—" "No, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards interrupted sharply, his voice filled with an undeniable authority that made every word feel like a command. "There has been a clear and sustained pattern of discrimination, harassment, and blatant disrespect, and it ends right here, right now." As the full weight of Mr. Edwards's words sank in, Regina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone with the power to do something about the situation had seen the truth and was ready to act. It was the first real sense of justice she had felt since she'd arrived at St. Mary's. Just then, there was a knock on the door, and a nurse entered, her face pale and nervous. "Dr. Greaves, the hospital administrator has requested your presence in her office immediately. It's urgent. We will continue this conversation later." "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice cold and measured, eyes narrowed with authority. "Nurse Holmes, you are dismissed for now. I'd like to speak with you privately in a few minutes." As Dr. Greaves hurried out, clearly flustered, Regina was left alone with Mr. Edwards. A strange mix of hope and trepidation surged through her. She had a feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. "I think it's time I properly introduced myself. Nurse Holmes," Mr. Edwards said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips, his eyes softening for a moment. "My name is Thomas Edwards, and I am the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest and most influential healthcare conglomerates in the country." Regina's jaw dropped in shock, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Everything was beginning to make sense. "Please, sit down, Nurse Holmes," Mr. Edwards said, gesturing to a chair nearby. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." Over the next hour, Mr. Edwards explained to Regina that his unexpected stay at St. Mary's had exposed a number of serious issues that he could no longer ignore. He had come to the hospital expecting to receive high-quality care. But instead, he had witnessed a pervasive culture of discrimination and bias that he simply could not accept. He had seen how Regina had been treated, how she had been unfairly targeted, undermined by Dr. Greaves and others, and how the hospital staff seemed to have little regard for her competence or dignity. But he had also been deeply impressed by her resilience, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to her patients, despite the obstacles she faced. "Your experience, unfortunately, is not unique, Nurse Holmes," Mr. Edwards said somberly, his voice tinged with frustration. "But it is completely unacceptable, and I intend to put an end to it. Starting right here." As he spoke, Regina felt a heavy weight lifting from her shoulders, a burden that she had been carrying for far too long. She was finally being seen. finally being heard, and finally being validated. Thank you for your honesty and your courage, Mr. Edwards, Regina said, her voice thick with emotion. You have no idea how much this means to me. No, Nurse Holmes, he replied, his tone gentle but firm. Thank you, you have reminded me of why I entered healthcare in the first place, to make a positive difference in people's lives. You've proven your own strength and resilience. But it's time for systematic, not just individual, success. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and the hospital administrator entered, her face pale and strained, a look of tension and worry written all over her features. Mr. Edwards, the administrator said nervously, her voice shaky as she stepped further into the room. I am now fully aware of the situation, and I want to assure you that we are taking this very seriously. Oh, really? Mr. Edwards responded sharply, his tone cold and cutting. Because all I've seen so far is a discriminatory status quo that is completely unacceptable. We have diversity and inclusion initiatives in place. The administrator tried to explain, but her voice lacked conviction, trailing off as if even she wasn't sure of the effectiveness of the measures. That is simply not enough. Mr. Edwards snapped back, his anger growing. You need a complete overhaul of the hospital's policies, practices, and culture, and it starts at the very top. The administrator swallowed hard, but Mr. Edwards was relentless. Over the next few hours, he laid out his demands, making it crystal clear that he expected immediate and decisive action. He insisted on a thorough and independent investigation into the patterns of discrimination at St. Mary's, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff members, and a complete overhaul of the hospital's policies regarding hiring, promotion, and patient care. As for Dr. Greaves, Mr. Edwards was unyielding. He made it clear that he expected Dr. Greaves's behavior to be fully investigated, and that there would be serious consequences for his actions, up to and including termination. The administrator, realizing that the very future of the hospital was at stake, numbly agreed to all of Mr. Edwards's demands. The investigation that followed proved both Mr. Edwards's and Regina's suspicions. There was, indeed, systemic and entrenched racism within the hospital. As the day wore on, word of what had transpired spread like wildfire throughout St. Mary's, and the atmosphere became electric with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and hope. Some of the staff members who had previously discriminated against Regina were now terrified of losing their jobs, while others, who had secretly sympathized with her plight, felt a surge of optimism. Perhaps things might finally change for the better. Regina was recommended for a leadership position on the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee and would play a pivotal role in creating and implementing meaningful changes at St. Mary's. Before leaving the hospital that evening, Regina visited Mr. Edwards one last time to express her heartfelt gratitude. You've been absolutely amazing, Mr. Edwards, Regina said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't intervened. The amazing one here is you, Ms. Parker, Mr. Edwards began, his eyes filled with respect, for your strength and courage to do your job amidst everything that was happening. Thank you. Now, I'd like to talk to you about your future. As they parted ways, Regina walked out of St. Mary's, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and determination. She knew this was just the beginning. The real changes, the lasting ones, would require even more hard work. But she was ready for the challenge. In the months that followed, St. Mary's underwent a dramatic transformation. Under Regina's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer, the hospital's culture began to shift toward inclusivity. She made it her mission to build a foundation of tolerance, awareness, and respect at St. Mary's. With her guidance, diversity and inclusion training programs were implemented for all staff members. Hospital policies were reviewed and revised to ensure fairness, and new procedures were put in place to address incidents of discrimination and harassment. Dr. Greaves was dismissed, sending a resounding message that prejudice and discrimination would no longer be tolerated within the hospital. A more diverse range of job candidates was actively recruited to work at St. Mary's, and the hospital became a model for inclusive practices in healthcare. As the changes at St. Mary's gained national attention, Regina found herself speaking at medical conferences and diversity seminars, sharing her experiences and offering guidance to other organizations seeking to improve their own cultures. She had become a beacon of hope and a symbol of the power of resilience. 1 year after Mr. Edwards's intervention, Regina stood before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference, addressing a crowd of doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and policymakers. The weight of the moment was not lost on her as she took the stage, feeling the eyes of the audience on her. A year ago, I was a nurse on the verge of giving up, feeling isolated and defeated, she began, her voice unwavering with conviction. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is not only possible but necessary. Even the most entrenched systems can be transformed with courage, determination, and a commitment to justice. After the conference, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered from his injuries, approached Regina with a warm, proud smile. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with admiration. They discussed the remarkable progress at St. Mary's and the ripple effects it had created throughout the healthcare industry. Mr. Edwards shared that other hospitals and healthcare systems had started implementing similar diversity and inclusion programs. Inspired by the success of St. Mary's, "You know, Regina," he said thoughtfully, "when I checked into St. Mary's after my skiing accident, I never could have imagined the extraordinary journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed St. Mary's into a model of inclusivity, but you've also reignited my own passion for this work. You've reminded me of what's truly important in the world." Returning to St. Mary's, Regina reflected on her incredible journey. She thought back to her first day at the hospital, the coldness, the hostility, the moments when she had nearly given up hope. And now, as she walked through the halls of the transformed St. Mary's, she could feel the palpable difference in the air, the sense of belonging, the mutual respect that had replaced the old atmosphere of fear and prejudice. Arriving back at St. Mary's, Regina was greeted by Sarah, once a cold and dismissive colleague, now a strong ally and friend. The hospital buzzed with a new energy, a feeling of unity and purpose that had been missing for so long. In the main lobby, Regina paused before a new mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, technicians, and support staff, all working together harmoniously. A plaque below the mural read, "Diversity is our strength, inclusion is our commitment, compassion is our calling." As Regina settled into her office, ready to tackle new challenges and continue her work toward building a truly equitable and just healthcare system, she smiled. The transformation of St. Mary's was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts and minds, dismantling systemic barriers, and creating a more inclusive and compassionate world was ongoing. And Regina was ready to lead the charge.